Well, hello everyone. Here we are again. This time with Susy Barnes, who is the RJ Coordinator for Manchester and Salford. Thank you very much for finding time to receive me. First thing that I'd like to ask you, and this goes a bit with what we were talking before about, is how do you get into restorative justice? Can you tell us a bit about your background and how you went from there to being the coordinator for Manchester and Salford?
Mm-hmm. I've been in probation for about 15 years now and hadn't really heard about it until maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and was listening to Radio 4, and there was a programme on there and it just stopped me in my tracks. It was a pensioners who'd been burgled and were talking about how it had impacted on them, and that they were frightened to go in, they were staying, they were frightened to go out, and that it had been arranged for them to meet the burglar, and it was something that changed their lives, and that they had eventually become friends with this person. Mm-hmm. He had since gone on to start visiting prisons, start talking to other offenders about this, and I just remember being really taken with this idea that, and it's what he said was that all his life, and he had a fairly typical story, that he'd been in the care system, he'd been abused, he'd got involved with drugs and alcohol, so this was just what he did. And he said for the first time in his life, the first people to ever listen to him were these two elderly people whom he had burgled, and for them to hear his story, and again it just stopped me in my tracks, and I thought, I have to get involved with this. This is something that how certain things in your life just strike a chord, and
you think that's the right thing to do. And
oh yeah, and I think coming from this probation background, which over the years has been so much about, well, sometimes it's about being punitive and about enforcement, other times it's about befriending and helping, and it's never very consistent in probation. It tends to be cyclical, and this just seemed like it seemed to be such a good approach to dealing with situations. It was this, and that's something I often say, is it's the opposite of our Jeremy Kyle culture, which is all about whipping people up into a frenzy of bitterness and anger and hatred, and this seemed like the polar opposite of that. Mm-hmm. So I did. I went and I firstly found out if I could do my training in probation, but at the time that wasn't possible. So I went and got trained with the police service in Ashton-under-Lyne, and then was able to start putting a bit of that into practice in my work. Mm-hmm. So I then had a year pretty much left to my own devices, but where offender managers were referring cases to me who had almost invariably been cases who had been in custody, and while in custody they'd been introduced to the idea of restorative justice, mm-hmm. and then were coming out and wanting to do something about it, so they were referred to me. So my starting point was actually with an offender rather than a victim, mm-hmm. which meant it had to be handled quite sensitively, mm-hmm. Because obviously bearing in mind it is always victim-led. Mm-hmm. So you have offenders who are very enthusiastic and very keen, and they want to do right, but then you've got to be careful that in talking to the victims, you're not inadvertently putting them under pressure.
Mm-hmm. Also, like you said, the perception is that it's victim-led, but obviously you cannot approach the victim first until you have certainty that the offender wants to take part as well, because otherwise you are risking raising expectations that then cannot be met. Yeah. And also, it depends on how you present it to the victim after having talked to the offender. It could look like this is something that the offender wants, whether the victim wants it or not. Mm-hmm. And that's a bit of a difficult position to put oneself in.
Yeah. And I think it's something that I learned as I went along, how much the right way of presenting it, and always being clear with the victim that, yes, this was something that their offender had said they would be interested to do, but that didn't put them under any obligation, that they should only engage with it if they could see that they would gain something from that process, mm-hmm. that they weren't there to help the offender. Mm-hmm. I've done 10 now in the last year, 18 months or so.
Also, what has been the feedback of those 10? I mean, and also crucially from the victim's point of view, and if you have it from the offender's point of view as well, because that's quite interesting as well. Sometimes we forget about that. Mm-hmm. So victims generally have been happy about the processes. Because restorative justice is said to achieve something like 80% victim satisfaction, if we can use that term. But what about the offender? Do you get feedback from them?
Oh, yeah. Without any exception, it has been something that, and it's been in varying degrees, from maybe at one end of the scale, offenders just saying, yeah, that was good, I'm glad I took part in that and I feel better, to the other end of the scale where people have just said, that has been life-changing for me, and categorically stating that they will not offend again, and I believe them. Really being given that opportunity to actually face up to somebody that you've harmed, and requires a huge amount of courage on both sides. But there are no losers with it. Everybody benefits from it. And you just see people walking up, and I suppose the most powerful case was a serious offence. It was a robbery and an assault late at night on a train station, and it was involved a university lecturer being hit over the head with a baseball bat, pretty much left for dead, his teeth knocked out, and the perpetrator got a 4-year prison sentence. While he was in prison, he said he made a choice only to mix with the lifers and the guys who were in for a long time, because he recognised that it wouldn't help him if he mixed with other young offenders. And he said it made a huge difference to him. The message he got from them was, don't end up like us, don't waste your life, learn from this experience and go out and make something of your life. So he was referred to me when he came out, and I took to him straight away. I knew that he was genuine. And I heard his story and how his life had been a lot of tension in his life at the time. He was from a Muslim background, and there were lots of expectations on him. But then he was also mixing with other very sort of westernised young men, so he was being pulled in that direction as well. And they'd got into a culture where drugs and violence were, glamorous, I think was the word he used. So he came out a very different person and really wanted an opportunity to meet up with his victim. So I traced him, got in touch with the university where he was working, and went over and met him. And it was interesting, he said that the victim he'd been asked about restorative justice when it first happened, and he just felt that it was too soon. He didn't want to get involved with it. He felt it was a tick box exercise. But that 5 years down the line, he said, yeah, if you can guarantee that this will be the actual person that committed the offence, not somebody who was driving a car as a getaway vehicle, but he said, if this is actually the person that assaulted me, then he said, yes, I'll meet him. So I worked with them both for a number of months, and then eventually they met, and it has been life-changing for both of them. And they both now want to be involved with restorative justice. They have agreed to come and give a talk later on to other young offenders, and I went out and had coffee, took them out for a coffee 2 weeks ago, and they were sitting like we are next to each other, and they just said, who would have thought this could have been possible 9 months ago? And the offender is working, he's got a good job, he's been promoted at work, his boss knows all about it, his boss wrote a letter of support, saying that, he's actually fundamentally a decent man. And the university lecturer said the same. He said, I knew from the letter that he sent that this was decent, that it was a one-off, this wasn't a pattern of offending.
That's a really touching story, and I think a very successful one as well. There's two things that I find interesting, many things, but two things that you mentioned that this was a process that lasted months. You spent months going back and forth, talking to the both of them, saying that the conditions were right. And I think that's something that people sometimes don't realise. Restorative justice does take time. It's not a quick fix, and it's not the soft touch alternative that some people think it is. Not not within the community, obviously, but outside the community of restorative practitioners, some people think that this is like equivalent of the slap on the wrist, and then this will diminish the sentence that they get from the courts, for example, things like that, when that's not the case. This is something that is parallel and additional in some cases. The other thing that was interesting is, and I wanted to have your views on it, is that sometimes, I mean, you have experience with offenders that have been convicted. Sometimes these people themselves may have been, without condoning their behavior, may have been victims themselves. Some people may have been under pressure from their families and groups, and then mixing with other people as well, finding that they need to act up because of their environments in which they move, perhaps not having the expectation of having a good job or education or things like that. So do you find that's a pattern among offenders?
I think it's something that we're aware of in coming from this probation background, is that the vast majority of offenders have been a victim at some point in their lives, and actually part of the preparatory work with them is looking at that victim awareness, and actually sometimes it's a reminder to them that actually they have been victims. So, and it's not about judging, and I think it is something that, you know, the criminal justice system, when they come into it as an offender, that's all they're ever seen as in terms of criminal justice. And I think that's often been the role in probation, is that you try and see another side to them, and they're not just offenders. And I think maybe that's why a lot of the time offenders will engage with RJ, and actually the trouble we more often have is trying to get a victim who will take part. Because often they've, especially when it's something that's happened in the past, they don't want to revisit it. They, you know, the thought of dragging it all up again.
It is reviving the pain.
Yeah. Which is, and again, it's interesting, I think, in the case that I mentioned, because it was coming up to 5 years ago, the victim had time to reflect on it. In many ways, he had moved on. He got his life back together. He was teaching. He'd got a young family, and you know, and I'm sure he sort of partly must have cursed me for turning up out of the blue, and actually he did get quite distressed the first time we met, and he was very shocked by that. He said, I thought it was all sorted. I thought I'd sort of put it all to bed. And he said, it's really surprised me, and he broke down. And I think that really shocked him, how it was still raw because it hadn't been resolved. He pushed it away, but he hadn't actually dealt with it. And I took the letter that the perpetrator that the offender had written, and he said he didn't open it for about 5 or 6 days. It just sat, and he said he couldn't bring himself to open the letter because he didn't know what was going to be in there. But when he did actually open the letter, he said it was such a relief, and he realised that it was genuine, that there was no agenda, that you know, the perpetrator, it wasn't about having a sentence reduced or anything made easier for him. It was genuine desire to make amends in whatever way he could.
I think that sort of thing is, in a way, part of human nature, isn't it? Because we live in community, we see each other, we live with each other, and generally we are all decent people. Sometimes, you know, there are some rotten apples, like everything. But generally people know and are educated to live in community with other people. They know that if they do something to someone else, that will have a consequence to that person. And what the justice system seems to do is to create a consequence for that person, for the perpetrator. But that consequence is disconnected from what happens to the victim, what's dealt with, what's done for the benefit of the victim, if anything. And I think that's just seeing the criminal justice system as a tool for punishment, rather than for improving things first for the victim, and also, if possible, for the offender. Your current work has to do with women as well. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, I co-wrote a women's programme which has been rolled out across Greater Manchester with some success. We have very good completion rates. So it's working with women offenders, predominantly acquisitive and low, medium risk offences. So Yeah, and we introduce restorative justice to them, and I have done a couple of conferences with women offenders, which seems to be, it's successful.
And what sort of objective do you have in that program?
Well, it's an offending behaviour program, so it addresses it looks at women's criminogenic need, because it's very different to men. The reasons that women get involved with crime are very different to the reasons that men get involved. Whereas historically, programmes for women have just been programmes that were written initially for men.
And then adapted, if at all.
Not even adapted quite often.
Okay.
So we wrote this programme and it was based on the Corston report, the findings of the Corston report, which looked at these pathways for women going into offending. And you can see it makes a difference. You can see it women relate to it. Mm-hmm. So we look a lot at domestic abuse and relationships play a big part in that. For a lot of women, it's the first time they've ever been able to acknowledge and talk about those things. And again, what came out of the Corston report, sort of almost the most important thing, was that in terms of services for women, that you provide them all under one roof, this idea of a sort of a one-stop shop. Mm-hmm. Because in the past, women were being sent to various different places to get help with finances, to get help with drugs and alcohol. Childcare wasn't available, so women just weren't accessing any of these services. So here at this centre, and increasingly across Manchester, there are different women and family centres where these probation programmes are being run from. And it means that women have creches where they can bring children, they can access counselling and drug and alcohol services all under one roof.
So it's sort of like a complete resource. So, I mean, the way I see it as well, and the logic for having everything under one roof is that, these people sometimes just are not in a situation where they have, I don't like to use this expression, but maybe they're not sufficiently educated to understand what's available, what sort of help is there for them. And if you make it difficult for them to reach it, then they're most likely not gonna get it. Mm-hmm. And you're not being able to help that people and help them address the issues that they may have in their lives when there's help available.
Mm. Absolutely.
So you were talking as well about, you actually posted on the forum about the use of restorative justice in cases of domestic violence. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us more about your interest in that area?
Yeah, domestic violence has been a big thing. When I first was in probation, I was a report writer, and my specialism then was domestic abuse cases. And then I went into running a domestic abuse programme and rolling out IDAP, it doesn't exist anymore, but Integrated Domestic Abuse Programme. So worked for about 8 years with DV cases. And then since, I chose not to do that work anymore, but in working with women, having worked in DV for so long, now I'm working with victims almost, I would say almost without exception, the women who come on to do the WISER programme are survivors of domestic abuse. Mm-hmm. So all that knowledge and experience I have from working with men is transferred over. And currently RJ is one of the areas that we don't use in domestic abuse cases. And it's an area that interests me, having sort of had these two things that I've felt really, they've had a huge part in my life, actually, these two things. And I know that across Europe, I think in Finland and in Austria and further afield in Canada, they're starting to look at working with domestic abuse cases. Mm-hmm. And I know nothing about that at the moment. Mm-hmm. I'm just interested to learn more. So there's a conference in December in London that I'm going to go to.
Okay. Do you think that some replies on the forum from Dr. Jackie Tapey, I think it is, didn't you?
Sorry, say again.
On the forum, you got some replies as
yes,
well,
I did.
Pointing to different sources of information and all that. Yeah,
and there have been, somebody's put me forward to, or put me in touch with someone there is work being done, and I think it is in its infancy at the moment. Mm-hmm. And what you have to be careful of is that you're dealing with extremely vulnerable victims here. My thoughts at this point are that it may well work more effectively if it's people who are no longer in the same relationship, so that again you remove that idea that for the perpetrator that there is an agenda, that this isn't just another means for him to manipulate a situation and to gain access to either a partner or children. Or so I think in terms of assessment, your assessment skills have to be very, very finely honed. But in cases possibly where it's historical, I wonder whether there's some mileage in using RJ then. I don't know. I really want to learn more about it, and I'd like to visit and go and talk to people where they have been using it and just see how it works. And
I suppose that without mentioning how very much more serious this is a bit like low-level crime between teenagers that go to the same school. It's difficult to mediate there when you know that they're gonna see each other again at school. Whereas in domestic violence and domestic aggressions, if they're still living together, then if things don't go absolutely right, they can go really, really wrong, and that's a big risk. So that's very, very interesting. I hope that once you find out more information and you get more experience on that, you can post it on the forum as well and let everyone know. Because I think I know that there are training courses to do with domestic violence that are run by different organizations. You might want to look at those if you have funding and the time. But anything you do on your own, because that seems to be the way you work. You find out things about just yourself out of your own initiative. So if you find anything and you want to share it with the members, then that would be great.
Yeah, definitely will do.
So, Susy, thank you very much for your time. This has been extremely interesting. I hope that it is useful for people as well at the forum. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.